The morning sun was just breaking over the hills when Tom McKenna rode his horse through the quiet valley. He had been up since 4 in the morning, like every other day for the past 2 years. Sleep didn't come easy anymore, not since his wife passed away from that terrible sickness that took so many folks in those days. Tom was 43 years old, with hands rough from years of ranch work and a face weathered by the Wyoming wind. His ranch sat about 5 miles outside the small town of Bitter Creek, where maybe 300 people lived on a good day. It wasn't much of a place, but it was home. He was checking on his cattle that morning, riding through a grove of cottonwood, trees that grew thick along the creek. The air was crisp and clean, the way it always was in the early morning before the world woke up. Tom liked this time of day. It was quiet, peaceful. No one around to ask him how he was doing or give him those looks of pity. He'd grown tired of Dot, his horse, an old brown Maori named Belle, suddenly stopped walking. Her ears went up, and she started acting nervous, like something was wrong. Tom had been around horses his whole life, and he knew when something was bothering them. "What is it, girl?" he said softly, patting her neck. Belle snorted and took a step back, refusing to go forward. That's when Tom saw it Dot at first. He thought it might be a scarecrow or maybe some old clothes someone had hung up to dry. But as he got closer, his stomach dropped. It wasn't clothes at all. It was a person. A young woman was hanging from the thick branch of an old oak tree. Tom's heart started beating fast, and for a moment he couldn't move. He'd seen death before. Too much of it during the war, and then with his wife. But this was different. This was wrong. He quickly got off his horse and ran to the tree. The woman looked young, maybe 20 years old, with long black hair and clothes that looked different from what the local women wore. She had the features of someone from China, like the folks who worked in the mines and ran some of the shops in town. Tom's hand shook as he pulled out his knife and cut the rope. He caught her body as it fell and laid her gently on the ground. Even though he knew it was too late, he felt for a pulse anyway. Her skin was cold. Dot, as he knelt there, trying to understand what had happened, he noticed something nailed to the tree trunk. It was a piece of wood with words carved into it. "No mercy from the white man's rope." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. This wasn't an accident or even a regular crime. Someone had done this on purpose, and they wanted everyone to know. Why? Tom looked at the young woman again. She was wearing a simple blue dress, the kind working folks wore, and around her wrist was a small jade bracelet that caught the morning light. In her hand, she was clutching a piece of paper with writing he couldn't read. It looked like Chinese characters. He sat back on his heels, trying to make sense of it all. Who was she? Why had someone done this terrible thing? And why here in this quiet grove where he came to find peace? The more he looked at the scene, the angrier he got. This wasn't justice. This was murder, plain and simple. But he knew how things worked in Bitter Creek. The Chinese folks kept to themselves mostly, living in their own section of town, working hard and trying not to cause trouble. Most white folks ignored them, and some didn't like them being there. At all, Tom had never paid much attention to the tensions in town. After his wife died, he pulled away from everyone and everything. He just worked his ranch, went to town for supplies when he had to, and tried to get through each day. But sitting there in the grove, looking at this young woman who would never go home again, he couldn't ignore it anymore. He carefully folded the paper she'd been holding and put it in his shirt pocket. Then he took off his coat and covered her body. She deserved better than this, better than being left like garbage for someone to find. Dot Belle was still nervous, shifting from foot to foot and looking around like she expected trouble. Tom felt the same way. Whoever had done this might still be around, watching. The thought made his skin crawl. He needed to get help, but he wasn't sure who to trust. Sheriff Clayton was a decent enough man, but he cared more about keeping peace and stirring up trouble. Tom had a feeling that if he rode into town and reported this, the sheriff would want to bury it quick and quiet, but he couldn't just leave her here. That wouldn't be right. Tom picked up the young woman's body and carefully placed her across his saddle. It wasn't easy. She was small, but it was awkward trying to be respectful while getting her secured. Belle didn't like it, but she stood still and let him work. As he led his horse back toward town, Tom's mind was racing. He kept thinking about that sign nailed to the tree. Someone had wanted to send a message to scare people. But the message they'd sent to Tom was different than what they probably intended. This young woman had been somebody's daughter, maybe somebody's sister. She'd had hopes and dreams, just like his wife had. She deserved to live her life, to be safe, to be treated with respect. Instead, she died alone and afraid, killed by people who saw her as less than human. The sun was getting higher now, and Tom knew people would be starting their day in Bitter Creek soon. He decided to take her straight to Doc Wilson's place. The old doctor had seen everything in his 40 years of practice, and he was one of the few people in town Tom still trusted. Doc Wilson's house sat on the edge of town, a neat white building with his office attached to one side. Tom tied Belle to the hitching post and carefully lifted the young woman's body. The doctor must have heard him coming, because the door opened before Tom could knock. "Good Lord, Tom," Doc Wilson said, his face going pale. "What happened?" "Found her hanging from a tree out by Willow Creek," Tom said quietly. "Someone killed her." Doc Wilson stepped aside and led Tom into his office. "Put her on the table there. Gently now." As Tom laid her down, Doc Wilson got his first good look at her face. He let out a long breath. "I know this girl." Her name was Lily Chun. She worked as a seamstress for Mrs. Patterson, did mending and such. Sweet girl, never caused any trouble. "Someone left a sign," Tom said, pulling the wooden message from his pocket. "Says no mercy from the white man's rope." Doc Wilson read it and shook his head. "This is bad, Tom, real bad." "You tell anyone else about this yet?" "No. Came straight here." "Good thinking. Let me examine her, see what I can tell you. Then we'll figure out what to do next." Tom stepped outside while the doctor worked. He sat on the porch steps, still trying to process everything that had happened. An hour ago, he'd been just another lonely rancher checking on his cattle. Now he was in the middle of something that could tear the whole town apart. But looking back at the door where Lily Chin lay, Tom knew he couldn't walk away. Someone had to speak for her, had to make sure her death meant something. And for reasons he couldn't fully explain, that someone was going to be him. 1 week had passed since Tom found Lily Chun hanging from that oak tree, but he couldn't get the image out of his head. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face. Every time he rode past Willow Creek, he felt sick to his stomach. Sheriff Clayton had come by the ranch 3 days after the discovery. He was a big man with a thick mustache who'd held the job for almost 10 years. People respected him because he kept the peace, but Tom was starting to wonder if keeping peace meant ignoring problems. "Now, Tom," the sheriff had said, sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, "I know you're upset about that Chinese girl, but sometimes it's best to let sleeping dogs lie. These things have a way of working themselves out." Tom had stared at him. Working themselves out? She was murdered, Clayton. Someone strung her up like an animal. Maybe so, but stirring up trouble between the white folks and the Chinese ain't gonna bring her back. Could make things worse for everyone. That conversation had made Tom angrier than he'd been in years. The sheriff wasn't interested in justice. He just wanted the whole thing to disappear. Well, Tom wasn't going to let that happen, so he started his own investigation. The first place he went was Chinatown, the small section of Bitter Creek, where most of the Chinese families lived. It wasn't much, maybe 20 buildings crammed together on 2 dusty streets. There was a general store, a laundry, a restaurant, and several boarding houses where the mine workers stayed. Tom had rarely been to this part of town before. Like most white folks, he just ignored it, pretended it wasn't there. But walking down those narrow streets, he realized how wrong that had been. These were real people with real lives, and they'd been living in fear. He could see it in their faces as he walked by. Children ducked behind their mothers' skirts. Men hurried past without making eye contact. Shop owners stepped inside and closed their doors. Tom was getting the message loud and clear. White men weren't welcome here, and for good reason. The only person who didn't run from him was an old man sitting outside the general store. He had gray hair pulled back in a long braid and wore the simple clothes of a working man. He was carving something from a piece of wood, his hand steady despite his age. "Excuse me," Tom said, approaching carefully. "I'm looking for information about Lily Chun." The old man looked up with sharp, intelligent eyes. For a long moment, he just studied Tom's face, like he was trying to decide something important. "You are the man who found her," he said finally. His English was clear but careful, like he was choosing each word. "Yes, sir. My name's Tom McKenna. I have a ranch outside town. I am Wei Chun. Lily was like a daughter to me." The old man's voice was steady, but Tom could see the pain in his eyes. "I'm sorry for your loss. I'm trying to find out what happened to her." Wei Chun set down his carving and gestured to a wooden crate beside him. "Sit. We will talk." Tom sat down, grateful that someone was finally willing to listen. "The sheriff doesn't seem interested in investigating. Says it might cause trouble. The sheriff is afraid," Wei Chun said. "And maybe he should be. There are men in this town who do not want us here. They have made this very clear." "What kind of men?" Wei Chun was quiet for a moment, looking up and down the street to make sure no one was listening. "Rich men, powerful men. They want our land, our businesses. They think if they scare us enough, we will leave. And Lily? Why would they target her specifically?" The old man's face grew sad. Lily was not like the other girls. She was brave, maybe too brave. She would not be frightened into silence. Wei Chun went into his store and came back with a small wooden box. Inside was a letter written in Chinese characters, the same kind of writing Tom had found in Lily's hand. "She wrote this letter to her family in California," Wei Chun explained. "She was planning to send it the day she died. I will tell you what it says." Tom leaned forward, listening carefully as Wei Chun translated the letter. Lily had written about being followed home from work, about men shouting ugly words at her on the street, about someone leaving threatening notes under her door. But the most important part came at the end of the letter. Lily had discovered something that scared her more than the threats. She'd been working late at Mrs. Patterson's dress shop when she overheard a conversation through the thin walls. Men were talking about buying up Chinese-owned properties for almost nothing, then selling them to mining companies for huge profits. She heard names, Wei Chun said quietly. "Important names. Men who run this town." "What names?" Wei Chun hesitated. "Duncan Morrison. He is the son of the biggest cattle rancher in the county. And there were others, shopkeepers, the bank manager, even some men who work for the territorial government." Tom felt his blood run cold. The Morrison family owned half the land around Bitter Creek. Duncan Morrison was known as a hothead who liked to drink and cause trouble, but his father's money always got him out of any real consequences. Lily was going to report what she heard to the federal marshals, Wei Chun continued. She believed they would listen to her, that they would stop the illegal land deals. But someone found out about her plans. Yes, the night before she died, men came to her boarding house. They broke down her door, searched through her things. The other girls were too frightened to help her. Tom felt sick. Why didn't anyone report this to the sheriff? Wei Chun gave him a look that was both sad and knowing. Would Sheriff Clayton have believed us? Would he have arrested Duncan Morrison based on the word of Chinese immigrants? Tom knew the answer to that question, and it made him ashamed. The truth was, most white folks in Bitter Creek wouldn't have cared what happened to Lily Chun. They would have seen her as just another Chinese person who was probably up to no good anyway. "There's more," Wei Chun said, reaching into the box again. This time he pulled out a small piece of cloth. This was torn from the dress of one of the men who searched her room. The girl who saw it happen, she grabbed it during the struggle. Tom, examined the cloth. It was good quality wool, dark blue with thin silver threads running through it. The kind of expensive fabric that only wealthy men could afford. Have you seen anyone wearing cloth like this? Wei Chun nodded. Duncan Morrison. He has a coat made from this material. He wears it when he comes to town for business meetings. Tom felt pieces of the puzzle starting to come together, but he needed more evidence. Would the girl who saw the search talk to me? Maybe. Her name is Rose Wang. She works at the laundry during the day, but she is very frightened. These men. They told her they would hurt her family if she talked to anyone. Tom stood up, his mind racing. Can you arrange a meeting? Somewhere safe. Wei Chun thought about it. There is a place. Behind the old mill at the edge of town. Tonight, after dark. But you must be very careful. If Duncan Morrison finds out you are asking questions, I understand the risk. That evening, Tom rode to the abandoned mill just as the sun was setting. The old building had been empty for years, its windows broken and walls covered with weeds. It was the perfect place for a secret meeting. Rose Wang was already there when he arrived, standing in the shadows with Wei Chun. She was maybe 18 years old, small and delicate looking. But Tom could see strength in her eyes. She told him everything she'd seen that night. How 3 men had burst into Lily's room, how they'd torn the place apart looking for something, how one of them had grabbed Lily by the arms and shaken her, demanding to know who she talked to. The big one, he had yellow hair and expensive clothes, Rose said in broken English. He kept asking about letters, about who she had told her secrets to. Did you recognize any of them? Rose nodded. The yellow-haired man, I have seen him before. He comes to the Chinese part of town sometimes, late at night. He looks at our buildings like he is planning something. Tom was certain now that they were talking about Duncan Morrison. But he needed more proof, something that would convince the federal authorities to take action. Is there anything else? Anything that might help identify these men? Ro looked at Wei Chun, who nodded encouragingly. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small metal button. This fell from the yellow-haired man's coat during the fight. Lily stepped on it when she tried to get away. Tom held the button up to catch the moonlight. It was silver with an intricate design, a cow's head surrounded by fancy scrollwork. At the bottom were the letters M.R. Morrison Ranch? Finally, he had real evidence. But as he looked at the frightened faces of Wei Chun and Rose Wang, Tom realized that having proof and getting justice were 2 very different things. Duncan Morrison and his friends had money, power, and the protection of people who didn't want to see the comfortable order of things. Disturbed Dot, but Lily Chun had deserved better than the life of fear she'd been living, and she certainly deserved better than the death she'd gotten. Tom was going to make sure someone answered for what they'd done to her, no matter how dangerous it got. The trouble started 2 days after Tom's meeting with Rose Wang and Wei Chun. He woke up that morning to find 3 of his best cattle lying dead in the pasture. They hadn't died from sickness or old age. Someone had poisoned them. Tom knelt beside the animals, his hands shaking with anger. These weren't just cattle to him. He'd raised them from calves, knew each one by sight. Now they were gone, and he knew exactly why Dot Bell, his Mare, was acting nervous again, the same way she had the morning he'd found Lily. Tom looked around the pasture and saw what was bothering her. His fence had been cut in 3 places neat. Clean cuts that would let his remaining cattle wander off. If he didn't fix them quickly, tied to one of the fence posts was a piece of paper. Tom's heart sank as he read the simple message. Mind your own business or lose more than cattle. Someone was watching him. Someone knew he'd been asking questions about Lily Chun's death, and they wanted him to stop. Well, they'd picked the wrong man to threaten. Tom spent the morning fixing his fences and moving his remaining cattle to a pasture closer to the house where he could keep an eye on them. As he worked, he thought about what to do next. He could give up the investigation, pretend nothing had happened, and probably be safe. Or he could keep going and risk losing everything he had left. The decision wasn't really that hard. Every time he thought about backing down, he saw Lily's face in his mind. She'd been brave enough to stand up to powerful men, even knowing it might cost her life. The least he could do was follow through on what she'd started. That afternoon, Tom rode back to Chinatown to find Wei Chun. The old man was in his store, helping a customer, but when he saw Tom's face, he quickly finished the sale and locked. "The door? They came after you," Wei Chun said. "It wasn't a question. Killed 3 of my cattle and cut my fences. Left me a note telling me to mind my own business." Wei Chun nodded grimly. "It begins. Now they will try to frighten you into silence. Just as they did with Lily. Well, it's not working. But I'm going to need help if I want to see this through." "What kind of help?" "Someone who knows the law, someone who can't be bought or scared off. Do you know anyone like that?" Wei Chun thought for a moment. "There is a woman doctor who came here from back east, Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell. She has been treating our people. When they get hurt, asking no payment from those who cannot afford it. She has seen the injuries that come from the violence against us." Tom was surprised. He'd heard there was a woman doctor in town, but he'd never met her. Most folks were suspicious of the idea of a female doctor, especially one who treated Chinese patients. "You think she'd be willing to help? She is not like other white people in this town. She sees us as human beings, not as problems to be solved. And she is very smart, very educated. She might know how to get the attention of people who matter." Wei Chun gave Tom directions to Dr. Hartwell's office, which was located above the pharmacy on Main Street. Tom had passed the building dozens of times, but had never paid attention to the small sign that read E. Hartwell, M.D. The stairway leading to the doctor's office was narrow and steep. Tom climbed it slowly, unsure what to expect. He knocked on the door and heard a woman's voice call out, "Come in." Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell was not what Tom had imagined. She was probably in her 30s, with brown hair pulled back in a practical style and intelligent green eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She wore a clean white coat over a simple dark dress, and her hands were clean and steady. The hands of someone used to delicate work. "Mr. McKenna, isn't it?" she said, looking up from a stack of papers on her desk. "I heard you were the one who found Lily Chun." "Yes, ma'am. Wei Chun suggested I talk to you." "Please, sit down." She gestured to a chair across from her desk. "Wei told me you've been investigating Lily's death." "That's very brave of you." "Don't feel brave right now," Tom admitted. "Someone killed my cattle this morning, left me a warning to stop asking questions." Dr. Hartwell's expression hardened. "That's exactly the kind of intimidation I've been seeing for months. The Chinese families come to me with injuries they won't report to the sheriff. Broken bones, cuts, bruises, always with some excuse about accidents at work or falling down stairs. But you don't believe those excuses. Mr. McKenna, I trained at Harvard Medical School. I know what injuries look like when they come from violence, and I know what they look like when they come from accidents. Most of my Chinese patients are being hurt by other people." Tom leaned forward. "What kind of injuries are we talking about?" "Doctor." Hartwell opened a drawer in her desk and pulled out a leather-bound notebook. "I keep records of everything I see. Burns on hands and arms that look like someone held them over a fire. Broken ribs from being kicked or beaten with clubs. Cut marks that come from knives, not work accidents." She flipped through several pages, showing Tom detailed drawings and notes about various injuries. The pattern was clear. Someone had been systematically terrorizing the Chinese community for months. "Have you reported any of this to the sheriff?" "I tried. Sheriff Clayton told me that Chinese folks are prone to accidents because they're not used to American ways of working. He suggested I stop treating them if I was concerned about their safety." Tom shook his head in disgust. "So, you think this is all connected to what happened to Lily?" "I'm certain of it. Lily was one of my patients. She came to see me about 3 weeks before she died, complaining of headaches and trouble sleeping. When I examined her, I found bruises on her arms that looked like someone had grabbed her hard enough to leave marks." Dr. Hartwell turned to a specific page in her notebook and showed Tom a detailed sketch of Lily's injuries. She told me she'd fallen down some stairs, but these bruises were in the shape of fingers. Someone had been rough with her. Did she say who? No, she was too frightened. But she did ask me about something strange. She wanted to know if I knew any lawyers who worked for the federal government, people who investigate crimes that local sheriffs wouldn't handle. Tom felt a chill run down his spine. What did you tell her? I gave her the name of a federal prosecutor I'd met in Denver. I told her how to contact him if she ever needed help with something too big for local law enforcement. And then she died 3 weeks later. Exactly. Dr. Hartwell closed her notebook and looked directly at Tom. Mr. McKenna, I believe Lily was murdered because she was going to expose a criminal conspiracy. And I believe the same people who killed her are now trying to intimidate you into staying quiet. Tom told her everything he'd learned from Wei Chun and Rose Wang, about the land deals, about Duncan Morrison, about the evidence they collected. Dr. Hartwell listened carefully, taking notes and asking detailed questions. This is bigger than just one murder, she said when he finished. If they're buying Chinese-owned property illegally and selling it to mining companies, we're talking about fraud worth thousands of dollars, maybe tens of thousands. But how do we prove it? And even if we can prove it, who's going to believe? You? Dr. Hartwell stood up and walked to her window, looking down at the busy street below. I still have that contact in Denver, the federal prosecutor. His name is Judge Harrison Wells, and he specializes in territorial crimes. If we can put together a strong enough case, he'll listen. What kind of case? Medical evidence of the systematic violence against Chinese residents. Witness testimony about the land deals. Physical evidence linking Duncan Morrison to Lily's murder. And documentation of the intimidation campaign against anyone who asks questions. Tom felt a spark of hope for the first time in days. You really think this could work? I think it's our only chance. But Mr. McKenna, you need to understand something. If we do this, if we really go after these people, they're not going to stop with killing cattle and cutting fences. They're going to come after us directly. Tom thought about his empty house, his quiet ranch, his lonely life since his wife died. Then he thought about Lily Chun, hanging from that oak tree with a sign that mocked her death. Let them come. He sighed quietly. I've got nothing left to lose, and she deserves justice. Dr. Hartwell smiled for the first time since he'd arrived. Then we better get to work. I'll contact Judge Wells and arrange a meeting. You work with Wei Chun to gather more witness testimony, and both of us need to be very, very careful. As Tom left the doctor's office, he felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time, hope mixed with purpose. He wasn't alone in this fight anymore. He had allies who were just as committed to seeing justice done as he was. But as he walked down Main Street toward his horse, Tom noticed something that made his blood run cold. Duncan Morrison was standing outside the saloon, watching him with cold, calculating eyes. When their gazes met, Morrison smiled and tipped his hat in a mock greeting. The message was clear. They knew about his meeting with Dr. Hartwell, and they weren't worried about what he might do. That confidence told Tom more than any threat could have. These people believed they were untouchable, that no one would dare challenge their power. They were about to find out how wrong they were. 3 weeks after his meeting with Dr. Hartwell, Tom was ready to make the most dangerous trip of his life. They had gathered enough evidence to present a solid case to Judge Harrison Wells in Denver, but getting there alive was going to be the CHALLENGE. Dr. Hartwell had received a letter from the federal prosecutor confirming their meeting. Judge Wells was very interested in their case and had agreed to see them immediately if they could make it to the territorial capital. The problem was that Denver was a 2-day ride through mountain passes that would be perfect for an ambush. Tom had been preparing for this trip carefully. He cleaned his rifle, checked his ammunition, and mapped out 3 different routes to Denver. He'd also been watching his back constantly, knowing that Duncan Morrison and his friends were planning something. The signs had been getting worse. 2 nights ago, someone had thrown rocks through Dr. Hartwell's office windows. Yesterday, Tom had found his water well poisoned with dead animals. The message was clear: stop the investigation or face the consequences. But the final straw came. That morning when Tom rode into Chinatown to say goodbye to Wei Chun, the old man's store was closed, which was unusual for a Wednesday morning. When Tom knocked on the door, Rose Wan answered with tears in her eyes. "They took him," she said in broken English. "Men came last night. They said Wei Chun was causing trouble, that he needed to learn his place." Tom's heart sank. "Where did they take him?" "I don't know. They put him in a wagon and drove toward the Morrison Ranch. He told me to give you this if something happened." Rose handed Tom a small package wrapped in cloth. Inside was Wei Chun's carved wooden figure and a note written in careful English. "Do not let my sacrifice be meaningless. Get justice for Lily. Get justice for all of us." Tom stared at the note, feeling rage build in his chest. These people had taken a harmless old man just to send him a message. Well, the message he was getting wasn't the one they intended to send. "Rose, you need to hide," Tom said urgently. "Pack whatever you can carry and go stay with family in another town. These men won't stop until they've hurt everyone who helped me." Rose nodded, still crying. "What about Wei Chun?" "I'm going to get him back. And I'm going to make sure the people who took him pay for what they've done." Tom rode straight to Dr. Hartwell's office. She was packing medical supplies into her travel bag, getting ready for their trip to Denver. When she saw his face, she knew something terrible had happened. "They took Wei Chun," Tom said without preamble. "Kidnapped him right out of his store last night." Double quotes Dr. Hartwell sat down heavily in her chair. "This has gone too far. We have to contact the territorial marshals immediately. There's no time for that. By the time we get word to them and they send someone, Wei Chun could be dead. We need to leave for Denver now, today, while we still can. But what if this is exactly what they want? What if they took Wei Chun to force us to travel when they're ready for us?" Tom had thought about that possibility. Maybe. But we can't help Wei Chun if we're dead. And we can't get justice for Lily if we never make it to Denver. We have to take the risk. Dr. Hartwell finished packing her bag. "I've been thinking about the safest route. The main road through Eagle Pass is the most direct, but it's also the most obvious place for an ambush. There's an old mining trail that goes through Devil's Canyon. It's harder traveling, but less predictable. I know that trail. Used it during the war when we needed to move quietly. It's rough, but you're right. They won't expect us to go that way." They agreed to meet at the edge of town just after sunset. Tom would bring the horses and supplies, while Dr. Hartwell would carry their evidence and her medical bag. If something happened to one of them, the other would have to continue the mission alone. Tom spent the afternoon preparing for what might be his last ride. He loaded his saddlebags with ammunition, dried food, and water. He wrote a letter explaining everything they discovered and left it hidden in his house. Just in case they didn't make it to Denver as the sun started to set, Tom saddled 2 horses and rode to the meeting point. Dr. Hartwell was already waiting, dressed in practical traveling clothes with her hair tied back under a hat. She looked nervous but determined. "Ready?" Tom asked. "As ready as I'll ever be." "Tom, before we go, there's something you should know. I sent a telegram to Judge Wells this morning, telling him we were coming. If we don't arrive by Friday, he'll know something happened to us. Good thinking. At least someone will know we tried." They rode out of Bitter Creek as darkness fell, taking the long way around town to avoid being seen. The mining trail started about 5 miles north, winding up into the mountains through terrain that was beautiful during the day but treacherous at night. For the first few hours, everything went smoothly. They made good time on the lower part of the trail, and Tom started to think they might actually make it to Denver without trouble. That's when he heard the sound that made his blood run cold, horses following them in the darkness. "Dr. Hartwell," he said quietly, "we've got company." She turned in her saddle, listening. "How many?" At least 3, maybe more. They're trying to stay quiet, but horses can't move through these rocks without making noise. Tom looked ahead at the trail. They were approaching Devil's Canyon, where the path narrowed between high rock walls. It would be the perfect place for an ambush, but it was also the only way forward. "What do we do?" Dr. Hartwell asked. "We can't outrun them. They know this country as well as we do. And we can't go back. That's exactly what they want us to do." Tom made a quick decision. "There's a side trail about half a mile ahead that leads to an old mine shaft. We're going to take it and try to lose them in the darkness." They pushed their horses harder, racing toward the turnoff. Behind them, the sound of pursuit was getting louder. Whoever was following them had given up trying to be quiet and was closing the distance fast. The side trail was barely visible in the moonlight, just a narrow path that wound between the rocks. Tom led the way, trusting his horse to find safe footing in the darkness. Dr. Hartwell followed close behind, her medical bag bouncing against her saddle. They had almost reached the mine shaft when the shooting started. Tom heard the crack of rifles echoing off the canyon walls and saw muzzle flashes in the darkness behind him. A bullet whistled past his ear, close enough that he could feel the wind from it. "Get down," he shouted to Dr. Hartwell. They both leaned low over their horses' necks, racing toward the shelter of the abandoned mine. More shots rang out, and Tom heard one of the bullets hit a rock near his horse's hooves, sending sparks flying. The mine entrance was a dark hole in the side of the mountain, barely wide enough for a horse and rider. Tom plunged into it without hesitation, Dr. Hartwell right behind him. The tunnel went back about 50 feet before opening into a larger chamber where miners had once worked. Tom quickly dismounted and grabbed his rifle. "Stay with the horses," he told Dr. Hartwell. "Keep them quiet." He positioned himself at the tunnel entrance, where he could see out but stay hidden in the shadows. 3 men on horseback had stopped at the bottom of the trail, arguing about something. Tom could see them clearly in the moonlight, and his worst fears were confirmed. Duncan Morrison was there, along with 2 men Tom recognized as his hired hands. They were armed with rifles and pistols, and they looked like they meant business. "We know you're in there, McKenna," Morrison shouted. "Come out now and we'll make this quick." Tom didn't answer. He was thinking fast, trying to figure out their options. The mine shaft went deeper into the mountain, but he didn't know if there was another way out. They could stay hidden and hope Morrison's group would give up, but that seemed unlikely. "You've got 10 minutes to come out," Morrison yelled. "Then we're coming in after you." Tom looked back at Dr. Hartwell, who was holding the horses steady despite the gunfire. She looked scared but determined, and Tom realized she was counting on him to get them out of this alive. That's when he remembered something from his war days. Sometimes the best defense was a good offense. Morrison and his men expected them to stay hidden and wait to be captured. They wouldn't expect a direct attack. Tom checked his ammunition and took a deep breath. He'd been in worse situations during the war and survived. The difference was that this time, he wasn't fighting for territory or politics. He was fighting for justice, for Lily Chun, for Wei Chun, and for the idea that right should triumph over might. "Dr. Hartwell," he said quietly, "when I start shooting, you take the horses and head deeper into the mine. Look for another way out." "What are you going to do?" "What I should have done the day I found Lily. I'm going to fight back." Tom took aim at the 3 men below and squeezed the trigger. The shot echoed through the canyon like thunder, and Duncan Morrison's hat flew off his head. The real fight was just beginning. The gunfight at the mine shaft lasted less than 10 minutes, but it changed everything. Tom's first shot had sent Duncan Morrison and his men scrambling for cover behind the rocks. What followed was a deadly game of cat and mouse in the darkness. With bullets echoing off the canyon walls like thunder, Tom had learned to shoot during the Civil War, and those hard-earned skills served him well now. He picked his shots carefully, making every bullet count. When Morrison's men tried to rush, the mine entrance, Tom drove them back with precise rifle fire. When they tried to circle around, he was ready for them. The fight ended suddenly when one of Morrison's hired guns made a fatal mistake. The man tried to get closer by climbing up the rocks above the mine entrance. Tom saw the movement in the moonlight and fired once. The man fell with a cry, tumbling down the rocky slope. That was enough for Morrison's other companion. Tom heard him shouting that this wasn't worth dying for, that they should go back and get more men. There was angry arguing, then the sound of horses riding away quickly. But Duncan Morrison himself stayed behind. "This isn't over, McKenna," he yelled from his hiding place. "You killed one of my men. That makes you a murderer." "Tell it to the judge," Tom called back. "Tell him about Lily Chun while you're at it." There was silence for a long moment. Then Morrison's voice came again, closer this time. "You don't understand who you're dealing with. My family owns half this territory. No judge is going to believe your word over mine. We'll see about that." Tom waited, listening carefully. He could hear Morrison moving through the rocks, trying to get a better angle on the mine entrance. Dr. Hartwell had found another tunnel deeper in the mine, and their horses were safe for now. But Tom knew they couldn't stay hidden forever. The standoff continued until dawn. As the first light crept into the canyon, Tom could see Morrison clearly for the first time. The man looked tired and angry, his expensive clothes torn from scrambling over rocks all night. His rifle was pointed toward the mine, but his hands were shaking from exhaustion. "Give it up, Morrison," Tom called out. "Your men are gone. It's just you now." "I'm not going anywhere until you're dead." But as the sun rose higher, Tom heard something that made him smile. Horses were coming up the trail, a lot of them. Someone was riding hard toward the canyon, and from the sound of it, there were at least 6 riders. Morrison heard it too. Tom saw panic flash across his face as he realized reinforcements were coming. But whose reinforcements were they? The answer came when a strong voice echoed through the canyon. "This is you, Marshal Robert Hayes. Throw down your weapons." Tom felt relief wash over him. Dr. Hartwell's telegram had worked. When they hadn't arrived in Denver as scheduled, Judge Wells had sent federal marshals to find them. "Marshal Hayes," Tom shouted. "Tom McKenna here. Duncan Morrison has me pinned down in this mine shaft. Stay where you are, Mr. McKenna. We'll handle this." What happened next was almost anticlimactic. Faced with 6 armed federal marshals, Morrison finally gave up. Tom watched from the mine entrance as Morrison threw down his rifle and raised his hands. The man who had terrorized the Chinese community of Bitter Creek, who had murdered Lily Chun, was finally going to face justice. Marshals found Wei Chun that same day. Morrison's men had been holding the old man at a line shack on the Morrison ranch, planning to use him as a bargaining chip. Wei Chun was weak and scared, but alive. When Tom saw him again in Denver 2 days later, the old man smiled and gripped his hand tightly. "You kept your promise," Wei Chun said simply. "Lily can rest now." The trial of Duncan Morrison became the biggest news in the territory. Judge Harrison Wells presided over the case himself, and he made sure everyone understood that this wasn't just about one murder. It was about whether the law applied equally to all people, regardless of their race or how much money their families. HAD Dr. Hartwell testified about the systematic violence against Chinese residents. She presented her detailed medical records, showing pattern after pattern of injuries that could only come from deliberate attacks. The jury listened with growing horror as she described what had been happening in their territory. Wei Chun took the stand next, speaking in careful English about the land grab scheme and the threats against his community. He told how Lily Chun had discovered the illegal property deals and planned to report them to federal authorities. Several other Chinese residents testified as well, finally feeling safe enough to tell their stories. Tom's testimony was simple but powerful. He described finding Lily's body, the investigation that followed, and the evidence they'd uncovered. He spoke about the intimidation campaign against anyone who asked questions, and the final showdown in Devil's Canyon But the most damaging evidence came from an unexpected source. Morrison's remaining hired hand, facing charges as an accomplice, decided to cooperate with the prosecution. He told the court everything about the conspiracy, how Morrison had organized the White Citizens Committee, how they'd been systematically terrorizing Chinese families to steal their property, and how Lily Chen had been murdered when she threatened to expose them. The trial lasted 2 weeks. When it ended, Duncan Morrison was convicted of murder, conspiracy, and a dozen other charges. The judge sentenced him to death by hanging, the same method Morrison had used to kill Lily Chen. Several other members of the White Citizens Committee were arrested and convicted as well. Some received prison sentences, while others fled to pleb territory rather than face trial. The conspiracy that had terrorized Bitter Creek's Chinese community was finally broken, but the real change went deeper than just punishing the guilty. Judge Wells used the case to establish new federal protections for immigrant communities throughout the territory. He appointed special prosecutors to investigate similar crimes in other towns and made it clear that racial violence would be met. With the full force of federal law, Tom returned to Bitter Creek a changed man. His ranch was still there, his cattle were still grazing in the pastures, but everything felt different. He wasn't the isolated, grief-stricken widower who had discovered Lily's body 6 months earlier. The experience had given him a new sense of purpose. He started working with Dr. Hartwell to establish a legal aid society for immigrant families. They helped Chinese residents file proper claims for their land and businesses, making sure they got fair treatment under the law. Tom learned enough Chinese to communicate with Wei Chun and his neighbors, building bridges that had never existed before. The old man became like a father to Tom, teaching him about Chinese culture and philosophy. In return, Tom helped Wei Chun expand his store and become one of the most respected businessmen in Bitter Creek. They often sat together in the evenings, talking about Lily and how her courage had changed their community. Dr. Hartwell continued her medical practice, but she also became the unofficial advocate for anyone who faced discrimination or violence. Her office became a safe place where people could report crimes they were afraid to take to the local authorities. She and Tom worked together on dozens of cases, making sure that justice wasn't just for the wealthy and powerful. 1 year after Lily's death, the entire town gathered for a memorial service at her grave. Tom had commissioned a proper headstone with her name carved in both English and Chinese. The service was attended by people from all backgrounds, white families, Chinese immigrants, and others who had found the courage to speak up for what was right. Wei Chun spoke at the service, his voice strong and clear. Lily Chun died because she believed in justice, he said, but her death was not meaningless. It taught us that we must stand together against hatred, that we must protect each other, and that we must never let fear silence our voices. Tom looked around at the faces in the crowd, people who had once ignored each other or viewed each other with suspicion, now standing together in respect for a young woman whose courage had changed their world. As the service ended and people began to drift away, Tom remained at the graveside for a few extra minutes. He thought about his wife, who would have been proud of what he'd done. He thought about the lonely, bitter man he'd been before that morning at Willow Creek. And he thought about Lily Chun, whose death had awakened something in him that he'd thought was gone forever, the belief that one person could make a difference. "Thank you," he said quietly to the headstone. "Thank you for showing me how to live again." Then Tom McKenna walked back toward town, ready to continue the work that Lily Chun had started, knowing that her legacy would live on in every act of courage and every stand for justice that followed.